Morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Today, what we're going to be discussing are Mendelian genetics, also known as how traits, variations, and how these things occur, and how they're passed on. Let's go ahead and get started. The first individual we're going to talk about today is Gregor Mendel. So Gregor Mendel was a botanist, so botany working with plants, who discovered the basics of how genetic variations are inherited or passed on using pea plants. So garden peas, the reason he used them are they're self-pollinating, easy to go ahead and cross-pollinate or go ahead and have them reproduce with one another, and they have easily definable traits. For example, the flower color is either pure purple or pure white, like you can go ahead and see below. What Mendel discovered was actually kind of interesting. So in the parent generation, the parent being the original two that he crossed together or reproduced, as you can see here, we have one tall and one short. So when he crossed these two, or had them reproduce, the offspring were all tall. This was curious. So what he did was went ahead and went, okay, tall must be dominant over short. So what he saw here was that both plants were tall. So the F1 generation is the offspring of the P generation. Consider it kind of like kids. And then his next cross was when he went ahead and crossed two tall pea plants. And here he noticed something that kind of concerned him. So in the F2 generation, or the grandkids, he noticed that he had primarily mostly tall, about 75%, but oh, wait a minute. Where'd this little guy come from? So this concerned him because roughly 1/4 of all the plants were short. And for the life of me, couldn't figure out why. So we need to go ahead and discuss some important terms here. The first one is a trait. A trait is any single feature that an organism can have. For example, in this case, the height of the pea plants. Other variations would include things like flower color, amount of peas in a seed, etc. Alleles. So an allele is a variation for a trait, and these alleles are passed on from each parent. So each parent gives one variation of the trait. In this case, we're looking at either tall or short. So the alleles are variations of our traits. Now with these, there is a dominant allele or variation, and there is a recessive allele, which is the one that's hidden. So the dominant in this case is the one that's normally shown and is represented by capital letters. So in this case, the dominant trait seems to be the tall pea plants. The recessive variety is the trait that is hidden behind the dominant variation and only shows up if there are two recessive alleles. So in this case, the recessive would be the short variation. So how traits are passed on? As you can see here, he went ahead and crossed a tall pea plant, recognized as the letters capital T, and a short pea plant, recognized by the two lowercase letters little t. And he noticed that, sure enough, all the plants were tall. And these tall pea plants were recognized by the letter pairing big T, little t. So in sexual organisms, each has two variations of a trait. One pair of each trait is passed on to the offspring by each parent. So we get one variation from our mother, one variation from our father. So if you think back, what is the trait that we're looking at here? I'll give you a sec. That's right. The trait would be height. The alleles, in this case, the variations, would be tall or short. Recognized right here, height being the trait, and tall or short being the variations or alleles. Now, Gregor Mendel proposed that certain factors segregate or separate from pairs to be passed on to the offspring. So this is just saying that Mendel proposed that different variations are passed down from our parents. Each parent gives one variation. Does that sound familiar? If you think back, this makes sense because this is what happens during independent assortment during anaphase 1. Finally, the last few things we have to talk about here are genotype and phenotype. A genotype, these are the pair of alleles for a trait. So example, these are the letters, either capital or lowercase. The phenotype would be the physical trait, or what you see. So today what we're going to be using is nose shape, or the shape of one's nose. So let's pretend that for this instance, a round nose, denoted by this up here, is dominant over a pointed nose, right here. So let's use the letter N for nose. So capital N would be dominant, and lowercase n would be recessive. So our genotypes would be the combinations we could get from these letters. So if you go ahead and pair these up, we could have one capital N, one capital N. We could have one capital lowercase, and we could have two lowercase n's. These would be our genotypes. So we call big N the homozygous dominant, or the purebred dominant. We call the capital N lowercase n the hybrid, or the heterozygous pair. And we call the recessive, or lowercase, the homozygous recessive, or purebred recessive. So what these would give us here, capital N, since we have two dominant letters, would give us a round nose. Capital N lowercase, we have one capital letter and one lowercase, so the dominant is the one that's going to show. So once again, we would have a round nose. And finally, lowercase n would result in our pointed nose. And that would be the only combination that would give us that combo. The final thing we're going to discuss are Gregor Mendel's principles. He had three of them. The first was the principle of segregation. So simply put, he states that every individual possesses a pair of alleles for a trait. And each parent passes a randomly selected copy of that to its offspring. So simply put, we get one variation of a trait from our mother, one from our father. The principle of independent assortment states that genes for different traits separate randomly during meiosis and the formation of gametes. And the principle of dominance states that alleles are dominant while others are recessive. So some traits will be dominant over others, and the dominant will mask the recessive ones. And that's going to go ahead and do it for today's PowerPoint on Gregor Mendel and the various properties of Mendelian genetics. If you have any questions, please go ahead and make sure to talk to your instructor. They'll put you on the right path. So until next time, you go ahead and take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.